but there are some things I am going to talk to you about right now. Before I begin, I want to read a couple of passages that we read about in Narnia. Starting with the very end of the Silver Chair, Eustace and Jill and Aslan are all in Aslan's country. King Caspian is lying dead in the water. And it says, "And all three stood and wept. Even the lion wept, great lion tears, each tear more precious than the earth would be if it was a single solid diamond. And Jill noticed that Eustace looked neither like a child crying, nor like a boy crying and wanting to hide it, but like a grown-up crying." The very next chapter that we read, although it was the following school year, is chapter 1 of The Magician's Nephew. And Polly first meets Diggory. Diggory's crying because his mom is very sick. And C.S. Lewis says, "Then his face went the wrong sort of shape, as it does if you're trying to keep back your tears." My prayer right now is that I'm going to look like Eustace, but my fear is I'm going to look like Diggory. But please bear with me. I'm going to ask you to take one final trip to Narnia with me. We're going to look at Narnia as a metaphor for your time here at WVCS, some lessons you can take with you as you leave, and some of the ways I see the characters in each of you. It all began with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in 6th grade. I want to begin by thanking Miss Arriaga for being a faithful guide on your first journey. I've been teaching for a long time. I know how common it is that we read something in class and 30 seconds later, nobody can tell me what we read. But 2 years later, these kids can still answer any questions that I have about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, 4 young children pass through a doorway into a magical new world. There, they meet the great lion Aslan, who dies in the place of Edmund, triggering the deeper magic, which causes him to rise again and defeat the witch. This story was clearly a retelling of the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is the single most important thing we need for you to leave this school knowing. Jesus died to pay the penalty for your sins and rose again, breaking the curse and offering eternal life to those who trust him. For some of you, that first trip through the wardrobe is like starting kindergarten. For those who are here, Mrs. Kirchman and Miss Sun played the role of Mr. Tumnus, making sure your first experiences in Narnia were pleasant. Luckily, none of you had the unfortunate experience of Edmund of meeting the White Witch. This class is special for several reasons. One of them is the fact that you were the first class that was ever split at this school. But you were also the class that began in kindergarten at this campus. In fact, a fun fact, much like in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there are 4 students whose first time going to school occurred here at this campus in kindergarten. 2 boys and 2 girls. There are many students who have come and gone at WVCS over the years, but only 4 who can say their first day here was literally the first day we were open and have lasted all the way until now. I see traits of those 4 children in all of you, but for our story today, if there's one student who most reminds me of Lucy Pevensey, it's Emma. Lucy is so very kind-hearted and good and pure, and Emma has demonstrated those traits over and over through the years. I have been keeping an eye on this class for a long time. Not only was I your PE teacher years before you came to middle school, but you are the class my own daughter came into. So I've watched Emma a long time and feel convinced of this. In fact, in one of the few moments where Aslan has to get on to Lucy, it's because she paused too long to check on Edmund after healing him. She simply cares too much about others. Sticking with the theme of those 4 kindergarten kids, being the Pevenseys, I'm picking Madeline as Susan, although not the Susan of the last battle who doesn't show up in Aslan's country. The reasons I see Madeline as Susan is because you were here on the first trip to Narnia, and because you and Emma have been together so often over the years, you're practically like sisters. My favorite memory involving the 2 of them is one day when I woke up and left my bedroom. I found Emma and Madeline cleaning my house while my kids sat around watching TV. Years ago, Madeline would jokingly call me Dad when she saw me, which was just her being silly. But I want you to know, Of all the students I've ever taught, not counting my actual children, you're the one I feel the closest to actually being a daughter. And I'm glad in this version of the story, Susan made it to the end. One of the two boys who started here in kindergarten was Rylan. I'm going to compare Rylan to Edmund, and not because I think he would betray his family for Turkish delight. For one, at the beginning of his time in Narnia, Edmund was sort of overshadowed by an older brother. When his brother was too old to return to Narnia, he started to come into his own. Another similarity is Edmund undergoes a massive change during his time in Narnia. Rylan, I think earlier this year, there was an extended period of time where you simply were not earning any AR points. But something lit a fire in you this semester, and this is to the point where you won the AR award for fourth quarter, which is a wondrous change to behold. Congratulations. Which brings us to Peter, the High King. If you noticed, when we got to the Hall of Fame portion of the House Cup slideshow this week, there are not very many boys on it. In fact, I think the most recent boys to earn a spot in the Hall of Fame are in college now, until this year. Colton, you remind me of Peter, the High King of Narnia. Not just because during that first trip to Narnia years ago you were so much taller than everyone else, but also because you have a dignity about the way you carry yourself. As I watched you over the years and saw you winning principals lists and dominating field day events, I thought maybe you would be a bit cocky when you got up to middle school, but instead you continued to excel while remaining humble. Well done. While those were the 4 students whose entire career at WVCS occurred at this campus, from kindergarten through 8th grade, there is one more student who came a bit later in the story, but who reminds me of a character from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There's a moment in the story where the children and the beavers need to make a quick escape as they realize the witch is on the way to capture them. As they are busy packing as quickly as they can for their journey, Mrs. Beaver asks the question. I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring, which certainly seems a bizarre question at the time. Now, some of you have had the privilege over the years of being in the room when I have tried to do Dibble's test with our good friend Haley. As I read the customary prompts ending with, do you have any questions? To which 99% of students respond, no. Haley would always think of a question to ask, and sometimes much more than one. Like Mrs. Beaver, Haley sometimes does what she wants at her own pace, and like Mrs. Beaver being slowed down by wanting to carry a heavy sewing machine, there are many times I have heard Haley exclaim that she was being slowed down by a heavy object, namely her giant shoes, in which she could potentially hide a sewing machine. The next book was Prince Caspian, which is the first you read with me. In this book, the children return to Narnia, but much has changed. The new Narnians, as the humans are called, have forgotten about Aslan and old Narnia. However, the 4 children and Aslan are able to help Caspian claim the throne and bring things back to the way they are supposed to be. There are many lessons in this that are practical for our times. For one, much in the country has changed, even just since you have been in school. You might not be old enough to remember, but when you started kindergarten, it was not yet legal in most of America for 2 men to get married, and transgender was not a thing you ever heard about at all. Today, our culture celebrates these evil things and has largely forgotten the ways of God. However, just as Narnia was restored through the actions of a faithful remnant, you can be a part of the solution to restore righteousness to the land. As Aslan eventually showed up and fixed everything, Jesus also is going to make all of his enemies into his footstool. Make sure you are not working against him when he does so. We are also introduced to some new characters in Prince Caspian, including the title character. If there is a son of Adam amongst us, whom I believe the Narnians would choose to be their king, it is Aidan Watson. Aidan, you are good and just, and perhaps the truest Narnian I have ever met. In the book of 2 Kings, Elisha asks Elijah for a double portion of his spirit. Sometimes I think you may have received a double portion of C.S. Lewis's spirit. Stay true to Aslan, and may he also grant you your star girl. Now, Caspian would have never even made it out of his uncle's castle alive if it wasn't for the help of his tutor, Dr. Cornelius. Dr. Cornelius is a scholar who has a vast knowledge on all subjects. It reminds me most of Alex. Quote, I would not be at all surprised to find one day has become Dr. Newman. It's unclear at this time whether or not Dr. Cornelius liked telling dad jokes. It was Dr. Cornelius who uttered one of the most repeated lines of the last 2 years when speaking about pen and ink. A scholar is never without them, which leads me to everyone's favorite bad scholar, Cassidy. Cassidy, I see you in Truffle Hunter the Badger. Not only are you scrappy like a badger, but also like badgers, and Truffle Hunter in particular, you are fiercely loyal. First of all, you have always demonstrated supreme loyalty to your family, always speaking so well of your siblings, and most significantly, choosing to be the leader of Zach's Minions this year. Besides that, as I think I've told you before, you are perhaps the greatest fan WVCS sports teams has ever had, and your enthusiasm for your House Cup teams has been excellent as well. There's one more character introduced in Prince Caspian that I'd like to bring up, and as soon as I do, most of you will know where I'm going with this, and that's Reepicheep. I'm not only saying this because he wants me to, but I do see Reepicheep in Brady. Like Reepicheep, you can sometimes be a bit saucy when talking to those who are bigger than you, and you also don't seem to be afraid of anyone, even when it seems like you should be. But most importantly of all, despite anything else, your heart always seems oriented towards Aslan's country. After Prince Caspian, we read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. This is one of the 3 books most often cited as people's favorite. Peter and Susan do not return to Narnia on this trip, and instead Lucy and Edmund are joined by their cousin Eustace, who has a remarkable transformation. They join Caspian on his quest to rescue the 7 lords who were sent away by his uncle, and eventually arrive at the very end of the world, where they say goodbye to Reepicheep. Then they meet a lamb who asks them to come and have breakfast, a conversation taken directly from the Gospel of John. As they are talking to the lamb, he is transformed into Aslan, who informs Lucy and Edmund they shan't return to Narnia again. They are greatly dismayed by this news, and Lucy says the biggest problem is they won't be able to meet Aslan in England, to which Aslan responds, "But you shall meet me, dear one." When Edmund asks if he's there too, he responds, "I am, but there I have another name. You must learn to know me by that name." This was the very reason why you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there. This conversation is perfect. The reason I have you read these stories is that you may know him better. The reason you were here in Narnia at WVCS was so that you would come to know Jesus better. Now I want to look at a few characters. The biggest new character in the book was Eustace, who was not a good kid, got turned into a dragon, had an encounter with Aslan, had his scales removed, got baptized, and became a new creation. This is the story of many of you, but what I want to mention in particular is Jonathan. I have to admit, when I used to be your PE teacher, I was afraid Jonathan was going to be a bit of a troublemaker in middle school, but he matured a lot. However, he has changed in other ways as well. It may sound weird, but this year, when I would watch Jonathan take a test or do an assignment, it filled me with joy. Because in the past, he used to stare at work like it was going to hurt him. The biggest things I have seen over the years, Jonathan, is that you have grown in confidence. I think some of it came from playing sports and realizing that you were really fast and really good at things, and that confidence transferred over to your schoolwork as well. In 6th grade, AR was sometimes a struggle because, like Eustace, you hadn't read the right books, but that has changed, and the same is true of so many others of you. There are many adventures on this quest to rescue the 7 lords, and I'm going to cheat a little by saying that I see Brandon and the 7 lords themselves. Well, some of them. First, there is Lord Byrne, who is chilling peacefully on an island in solitude, but when the time comes, easily transitions to becoming the Duke of the Lone Islands. Brandon seems fine working all alone, but also demonstrates leadership qualities when called upon. Then there is Lord Rube, the weird guy they find floating in the darkness. Perhaps my favorite memory of Brandon is the day in PE years ago, where I asked him to either pray or lead in pledges or something, and he started walking backwards in a giant loop across the whole gym to hide behind the bleachers so that he didn't have to. I did give him a 0 for that day, but it was very amusing. Finally, when they reach Ramandu's island, they discover 3 lords sleeping, although they don't recognize that they are people at first because all they see is a whole bunch of hair, which Brandon also has a lot of. As they continue their journey, they arrive on an island where some invisible people ask them to say a spell to make them visible again. Lucy enters the house of the magician, heads to a big room full of books, and says the spell, making the people, the Duffleputts, as well as the magician, Corey Aiken, visible again. For Corey Aiken, I see Peter. For one, after breaking the AR record, I think it's appropriate that Peter would have the largest collection of books in Narnia. Secondly, the magician caused the dwarves to have 1 foot as a sort of punishment for their stubbornness, and I could see Peter pranking short people to teach them a lesson. Further along, they come to the beginning of the end of the world, the island where they discover the 3 sleepers. While they're there, a beautiful girl walks up to them and just kind of stands there for a moment, not saying anything. It could perhaps have been a bit awkward, although there was a secret about her that they didn't know yet. This is where I see Isabel. When she first arrived here, she was super shy and quiet, but many of you were kind to her anyway. Eventually, she overcame it, at least a little. One of the proudest moments of my life was years ago when my shy daughter, who was afraid to talk most of the time, prayed in front of the whole school on a Monday morning. But there was also the secret about the girl. Turns out she was a star. There have been so many students over the years who have done good in the House Cup. For the first 9 years, there was also one thing that always happened. Every year, whoever was the MVP at the end did not return the following year. Most were 8th graders who graduated, although a few were 6th or 7th graders who moved on to new schools after that year. Then that all changed these last few years. I'm sure there are some people who maybe thought she did good because she was my daughter, but I want it to be known that I refused to give her any help at all. When Isabel would ask me questions about homework or what books to read, I would always tell her that it would be unfair, so she should ask her teacher when she gets to school. Isabel, as your parent, I don't think I've ever even told you to do your homework before, and at times I actually had to tell you to stop doing IXL or reading your AR book. However, as your teacher, the effort meant everything to me. There have been some hard times in the past few years, and sometimes being a teacher can feel discouraging, but your consistent effort going above and beyond has been my light that kept me going. You truly are a star, and I love you. As they get closer to the end of the world, things begin to get even stranger. There's a close encounter with some violent bird people, and then a curious event happens a little bit after that. As they sail along, Lucy looks down and sees a fish herdess, a young underwater mer girl who watches over fish like a shepherd watches sheep. They see each other for a brief moment, but C.S. Lewis tells us, in that one moment they had somehow become friends. If there's any student who could see someone of another species for one moment and become instant friends with them, it's Audrey. At times in the House Cup, Audrey hasn't actually been a shepherdess, but I could also see her being really good at that. The next book we read was The Horse and His Boy. This story actually took place back in the time frame of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It follows the story of Shasta, who believes himself to be the son of a poor fisherman, but discovers he is actually a slave. He meets a talking Narnian horse named Bree, and together they run away to Narnia in the north. On the way, they meet a Calorman girl named Erebus and a mare named Hwyn, who join them on the journey. They have multiple encounters with lions or big cats throughout their journey. And then one day, Shasta finds himself all alone in the woods with a mysterious invisible person. As he begins to talk to that invisible person and tell him his story, he says he has been very unlucky. The voice tells him he hasn't been unlucky, but Shasta says, "Don't you think it was bad luck to meet so many lions?" The voice responds, "There was only one lion." When Shasta asks how he knows, the voice responds, "I was the lion." For me, this is always one of the biggest goosebump-causing moments in the series. The lion goes on to inform him that he is the lion who has been watching over him and guiding him all his life, even when he didn't know about it. Then Shasta eventually meets King Loon and discovers not only is he not a poor fisherman,
but he's actually the son of the king and heir to the throne of Archenland. The first point I want to make from this book is that I hope when you have time to look back on the years you spent here, that you realize who it was that was watching over you and guiding you during your time here. The second thing I want to point out is this book takes place primarily outside of Narnia. We learn about two other lands, Archenland and Calormen. This makes me think about where you go from here. Some of you are leaving and heading to new Christian schools. They may have some different traditions or practices than we have, but they still serve the same God. I like to think that you're simply going to Archenland. Others are heading off to public schools, which can be more like going to Calormen. At different times, the relationship between Narnia and Calormen varies. Sometimes they are neutral, and sometimes they are hostile. For those who find themselves in Calormen, you should be like the Narnians that Shasta meets in Tashbaan. They remain vigilant and stay on guard so they are not tricked by the Calormens. May you be as wise. Others, like Isabel, are going to go study with the professor next year. If you end up having a rough time when you leave Narnia, the professor can find a way to squeeze you in as well. The first character I want to talk about is Shasta, who turns out to be really Kor, future king of Archenland. Many of you have similar stories during your time here. The one who really stands out to me is Daniel. Daniel, when he first got here, he kind of sat quietly and seemed to do just enough to get by. But as time went on, we realized there was much more than what we saw at first. When you walked up to get your certificate or honor roll yesterday, I thought, there goes Prince Kor of Archenland. One of Shasta's companions was Bree the Warhorse, whom I see in Dominic. Like Bree, Dominic loves to run, but the thing that really does it for me is Bree's constant cries of to Narnia and the North. Bree always wanted his companions to stay focused on the task at hand. Likewise, Dominic always speaks up to get back on track when the class gets sidetracked. His other two companions are Aravis and Hwin. They are only in this one book, but they make a huge impact on the group. Similarly, Kamara and Ada Lopez were only here this year, but they had a big impact on the class. Like Aravis, Kamara arrived in Narnia from somewhere else. She is tough and speaks up for herself, and like Aravis, is able to see the good in others. Hwin, like Aiden, is a gentle spirit who doesn't insist on getting her own way, but speaks up when people are doing the wrong thing. When Hwin first saw Aslan, she instantly ran to him and said, "Please, you're so beautiful, you may eat me if you like," showing a pure and total respect for who Aslan is, as well as wonderful manners. I believe Aiden may have said thank you to me this year alone more than every other student combined in the 12 years I have worked here. There's one last character I want to mention in The Horse and His Boy. When we first meet him, Prince Corn Thunderfist breaks a vase while sneaking through a window. He has a black eye from getting in street fights for fun. He loves to box and is always up for a fight, but he's also good. If there's a student with a slight tendency towards destruction who's always in a good mood and looking to have a good time everywhere he goes, living to the full each moment, it's Ethan, who, like Corn, is deeply good, even with his rascally nature. We next read The Silver Chair, which is the immediate sequel to The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Eustace returns to Narnia with Jill Pole. They are given a quest by Aslan to recover King Caspian's lost son, Prince Rilian, and are given 4 signs by which to do so. They journey with the Marshwood Puddleglum to the north, forgetting to follow the signs for a while and almost end up getting eaten by some giants. Then they get back to following the signs, head underground, travel across an underground sea, and find a mysterious knight with a penchant for laughing. It turns out he was the very prince they have been searching for, but he is under an enchantment. The witch who enchanted him shows up and tries to enchant them all, attempting to convince them that everything they know is false. They eventually overcome her due to Puddleglum's bravery, return Rilian to Narnia, where he sees his father, King Caspian, one last time right before Caspian's death. Then Jill and Eustace are taken to Aslan's country, where Caspian is brought back to life to spend the rest of eternity in his true home. The first takeaway is about the 4 signs that Aslan gave the children. During their journeys, they would forget about the instructions of Aslan if they didn't continually think about them. They often missed the importance, and the signs often didn't look like what they expected. Throughout Scripture, we are reminded of the importance of regularly dwelling on the commands of God. In order to please God, you need to do what He says. In order to do what He says, you need to know what He says. Make a habit of regularly reading your Bibles, even when you aren't required to do so for school. But reading it without doing what it says is as useless as looking in a mirror and then walking away and forgetting what you look like. When the travelers met the lady of the green kirtle and explained what they were doing, looking for the ancient city of giants, She responded by saying they were doing the wrong thing and should instead head for the city of Harfing, where the gentle giants live. The world will twist and distort the truths of Scripture into things that sound good for those who haven't trained themselves to recognize truth. Don't be fooled by the lady of the green kirtle. Similarly, when they were in the witch's castle, she plays them some music and uses some green powder in the fire to try to enchant them and get them to doubt the things they knew before. She even got them to the point where they didn't believe the sun or Aslan or even the entire world were even real anymore. The enemy will use things, including music and social media, to try to enchant you into believing and accepting lies. They will make trans people into heroes in video games or movies so that you start to think trans isn't so bad, or even trans is good. They will call things that God calls evil good, and things that God calls good evil. Next month, there is an entire segment of the culture that will be actively celebrating the sin of homosexuality. Don't fall for it, and don't be lured by the witch's song. Satan disguises himself as an angel of light, we are told. Now, there are 3 girls who instantly come to mind when I think of Jill Pole. After getting to the end of the journey through Narnia, it's easy to forget that Jill came into the story very late. Likewise, Niall, Lucy, and Rachel, you joined our story very late chronologically, but it's easy to forget it because it feels like you've always been a part of the story. The impact and importance you've all had since arriving makes it impossible to imagine the story without you in it. Niall, you were Ethan Jill Pole in the House Cup before you even knew who Jill Pole was. Like Jill, you're a great friend, and like Jill, you're so sweet you would probably make the giants who were going to eat you cry at the idea. Lucy, you are athletic like Jill is after she spent some time in Narnia, and like Jill, I believe you'll successfully complete the task that Aslan sets for you. Rachel, there's a scene in the last battle where Jill disappears for a bit and everybody wonders where she is, and I have wondered that about you quite a bit as well. Also, Jill turns out to be incredibly accurate with her bow, and you perform well when we do physical feats as well. The silver chair could have been a much darker and depressing tale if it was not for the presence of the lovable marshmallow Puddleglum. Puddleglum was constantly predicting worst-case scenarios and consistently performing admirably despite what he said. We have been blessed the last couple of years to have Asher with us. He isn't just like Puddleglum because he's tall and skinny, though that contributes. Sometimes when I give assignments, Asher responds with some colorful turn of phrase, such as, "What is this madness?" and then performs excellently on it. And finally, just as the journey became much more bearable for Eustace and Jill, because Puddleglum was in it, I believe the last 2 years of school have been better for all of us, Asher, because of having you in them. Another character we get introduced to in the book is Rillian, the Lost Prince. When we first meet him, he is a mysterious figure, and we don't know what to make of him. Plus, he seems to randomly laugh a lot, and we don't exactly know why. Also, Jill thought his voice was lovely. He had a unique fashion sense as well. There's one student in particular whose first day I recall vividly. We were on the basketball court outside when it was still a full court doing PE when this mysterious new kid showed up. We didn't know what to make of him at first. He did seem to laugh a lot, and while I don't have any direct evidence of this, I'm pretty sure some of the girls in the class thought he had a lovely voice. It took a bit of time to get a feel for who this new kid was, and it turns out he was a fun-loving goofball. Of course, if you haven't figured it out yet, I'm referring to Aiden Disney. Also, Prince Rillian went for a walk one day and then didn't show up until 10 years later. There's one character I want to mention at this point in the story who had a bigger role earlier in the series, but then pops back up after a couple of books again, and that's Trumpkin. Much like Wyatt Fleissen and Caitlin, there was a time when he was a regular part of the story, and then a time where they weren't, and then a time where it's like, hey, they're back, and they're exactly the same, just older. Like Trumpkin, they both have a tendency for memorable catchphrases and sayings, and like Trumpkin, sometimes they make me repeat myself because they didn't hear it the first time. At this point in our journey through Narnia, we're now entering 8th grade. This year, we read The Magician's Nephew. It turns out the Pevensey kids were not the first ones to visit Narnia. In fact, there were 2 kids there even earlier who actually saw Narnia get created. Their names were Diggory and Polly. And we have amongst us some friends of Narnia who were here when here wasn't even here. Brody and Juliana were part of the West Valley family back when classes were still held at Skyway. It should be noted that Alex and Wyatt were here back then as well, but they are already Dr. Cornelius and Trumpkin. Those kids went to preschool at the old campus and were around when this building was first being built. They have deep ties here. I actually started here 12 years ago by tutoring Brody and Wyatt's sisters when they were second graders. Juliana's mom was briefly the Spanish teacher. Brody, like Diggory, I believe that you have a natural curiosity, which can be best seen in your exemplary academic record. Diggory does go on to be a professor after all. Also, Diggory didn't always make the best choices, but he did always seem to learn from them. And I think you have demonstrated an ability to correct your behavior when it was needed. Juliana, like Polly, you are caring, but you don't put up with silliness. Also, if a creepy old man ever tries to offer you jewelry, don't take it. This all leads us to the last battle, which we just finished this quarter. Basically, there's a false prophet Antichrist, and it's the end days, and then everybody dies, and they all go to Aslan's country, which is heaven. We'll get back to that in a second. There are a few new characters who are introduced in the last battle that I want to take a look at. First off, there's the last king of Narnia, Tyrion, which is where I see Sven. In Tyrion's day, things are not always great. In fact, it's rather dark and dreary. However, despite the turmoil going on around him, Tyrion remains true and loyal. Sven, I see this trait in you. Like Tyrion, I see you do the right thing, even when it's not necessarily the thing you want to do. Also, throughout the book, Tyrion experiences much loss. At different times, he realizes that Narnia is lost, hope is lost, the battle is lost. Similarly, Sven's Chromebook and belongings were also often lost. One of the next characters we meet in the last battle is Runewit the Centaur. I knew Trenton was a centaur, and the reason I picked Runewit over Glenstorm is that Glenstorm is more of a war centaur, while Runewit is more of a prophet. He has great insight and discernment and can read things out of situations that others are unable to see. Since you are his classmates and not his teacher, you have not had the privilege of grading Trenton's essay responses on tests. I'm not going to lie, some of them are so good I almost get choked up. If somebody read his responses, they could be confused into thinking that I taught him those things. But the truth is, I spent 4 years at university earning a degree in literature, and this middle schooler says more profound things than I have ever dreamed of. If you ever hear one day that Mr. Christie is teaching at a school somewhere, do what it takes to get your kids enrolled in that school and in his class. They will be incredibly blessed. A third new character introduced in the last battle is Farsight the Eagle. This is Malachi. Like Farsight, Malachi sees and notices things that nobody else does, whether it's how to solve a Rubik's Cube in the fewest steps, or analyzing an opposing team's defense for weakness. I'm convinced that Malachi notices mistakes that we teachers make on a regular basis, but he has the grace and humility to not point it out. Malachi, I want you to know that one of the highlights of the year for me was our morning strategy talks during soccer season, where you graciously listened to my ideas, even if they were stupid. Finally, there's one last person I want to mention. Throughout the book, there are a number of dwarves. The dwarves have a tendency to talk quite a bit in the last battle. They tend to stick to their own social group and are deeply loyal to that group. In the battle, some of them fire at both sides. However, there was one moment when everyone is passing through the stable door into Aslan's country, in which Eustace sees one of the dwarves who had shot the horses enter through the doorway, and he was surprised, although Aslan was not surprised. Wyatt Stewart, some people, perhaps yourself most of all, joked rather regularly that you weren't going to make it this far, and maybe even some are surprised, but God isn't surprised, and you are where you're supposed to be, further up and further in. And this brings us to the end of our journey back through Narnia, and to the end of your journey at the Narnia that is West Valley Christian School. But as C.S. Lewis says at the end of the story, for us, this is the end of all the stories, and we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover page and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. Thank you.